In 1864, Union troops broke open the iron doors of Thornhill Estate in Burke County, Georgia, and found 23 children huddled in the pitch-dark basement. Their faces carried the same haunting stamp: high cheekbones, pale green eyes, and hair the color of auburn, streaked with gold. The youngest was barely 4, the oldest a girl of 13, who whispered words that made hardened soldiers recoil. She said, "Mistress says we are her legacy. We cannot leave because we are her blood." The soldiers wrote almost nothing about what they saw. The only trace is a single sealed letter from the 34th Massachusetts Infantry, buried for more than a century in military archives. Burke County's official histories erased the Thornhill estate as if Catherine Thornhill and her crimes had never existed, but they did exist, and what she built in the 16 years after her husband's death was nothing less than a nightmare, a breeding program to create generations of enslaved people genetically bound to her, so they could never escape. Before we dive deeper into Catherine's world, if this story makes your stomach tighten, hit subscribe. Here we pull back the curtain on the ugliest, most secret corners of American history, the stories scrubbed from textbooks and tucked away in courthouse basements. And I want to hear from you. Where are you listening from? Are you close to Burke County, Georgia? Does your town have its own ghosts in the archives? Let's find out together. Our story takes us back to February 1847, when Catherine Danforth Thornhill, newly widowed at 28, buried her husband during the coldest winter Burke County had seen in 2 decades. The Thornhill estate sprawled across 1,700 acres of exhausted red clay soil, 7 miles outside Waynesboro. By then, cotton country here was fading, fields worn thin, profits shrinking, and creditors circling like vultures. Catherine's husband, Jonathan, had once inherited the place with wealth and workers enough to thrive. But his reckless gambling and mismanagement left it drowning in debt. When fever carried him off, he left behind a mortgaged plantation, failing crops, and a resentful teenage son. Catherine, educated, polished, and raised with the poise of old Georgia money, had not expected to inherit ruin. But what she did with that ruin would mark one of the darkest legacies in Southern history. Richard never warmed to Catherine. To him, she was the intruder who had stolen the place of his real mother, and he retreated into books rather than family ties. He lingered in the estate's dusty library, withdrawn, sullen, and more comfortable with paper than people. Catherine dismissed him as weak, soft-hearted, and far too sentimental about those she considered mere property, when Richard once suggested the enslaved should be taught to read. Catherine snapped, forbidding him from ever speaking such dangerous thoughts again. The plantation around them was falling apart, a reflection of Jonathan's debts and decline. The main house, once proud with its 6-columned portico built in 1805, showed its age, peeling paint, sagging roof, and furniture that was part heirloom, part cheap replacement after the fine pieces were sold to cover gambling losses. Outbuildings, the kitchen, smokehouse, dairy, and overseer's cottage leaned with neglect. Past the moss-draped oaks stood the quarters where fear ran deeper than the rot in the wood. 31 enslaved men, women, and children remained, knowing 16 of their kin had already been sold in just 3 years. More sales were expected, and the uncertainty pressed down on them like humid air before a storm. Catherine met the crisis with a cold fury. Ambrose Talbert, the family lawyer, laid out her choices bluntly. Sell the estate and its remaining enslaved workers, retreat to Augusta, and live quietly under her father's roof, or try to scrape profit from barren soil and worn-out equipment. Both options to Catherine stank of humiliation. She would not be pitied as the widow who squandered her inheritance, nor bow her head to her father as a dependent. But she was also too shrewd to believe cotton alone could rescue Thornhill. The land was exhausted, the labor force too small, and there was no money left to buy more workers. Somewhere between sleepless nights and the scratch of quill against account books, Catherine's mind twisted toward a new, horrifying solution. If she couldn't buy labor, she would breed it. Not the haphazard way most planters did, waiting decades for children to grow into field hands. Her vision was colder calculated, an absolute, a self-perpetuating population, bound not just by chains, but by blood. She would use her own body as the foundation. The strongest men would be chosen, their children raised under her direction, taught from birth that they were hers in every way. Favored treatment would ensure loyalty, and when grown, they would be paired to continue the cycle. What Catherine imagined was not simply ownership, it was a dynasty of bondage crafted in flesh and sealed by generations. To her, it was not monstrous. It was elegant. By Catherine's reckoning, within 2 decades, Thornhill would boast a captive workforce of 50 or more, every last one bound to her by something stronger than law blood itself. To make this vision real, she began a ledger she called her cultivation records. It wasn't a diary of sentiment. Catherine had no use for reflection or confession. It was a manual of control filled with numbers, diagrams, and coded language. In her private cipher, children became seedlings. The chosen men were rootstock, pregnancies were plantings. The pages looked less like human history than the meticulous breeding charts of a cattle rancher. Her first rootstock was Isaac, a 24-year-old enslaved man born on the estate prized for his strength and composure. On a March evening in 1847, she summoned him to the main house. What followed she reduced to a single clinical entry. First planting completed with rootstock 1, weather clear and mild. Over the next weeks, she called him again and again, until by April, she was convinced of success. Her journal noted it without a flicker of feeling. Initial cultivation successful. Anticipate harvest in December. Richard, her stepson, was the first to sense something amiss. By late spring, he noticed the small changes. Catherine no longer rode her horse in the morning, citing heat, though summer had barely begun. She ate in her room more often and had dismissed the maid who usually tended her. For a woman obsessed with appearances, this retreat was out of character. But it was the conversation Richard overheard in June that froze him. Tucked behind a tall bookcase in the library, he listened as Catherine met with Miriam Grayson, the county's midwife, in the parlor. Grayson, sharp-featured and known for her skill in silence, questioned her in a brisk tone. "You're certain of your condition?" Catherine's reply came calm and firm. "Quite certain. I expect early December." Then came the quiet question that made Richard's pulse hammer in his ears. "And Mr. Thornhill passed in February, you said?" Silence followed thick as storm air, and Richard held his breath, knowing with sudden clarity that whatever his stepmother was concealing, it was something unspeakable. Catherine's voice never wavered as she told the midwife, "My late husband and I were intimate in January, shortly before his final illness." Mrs. Grayson didn't contradict her, though Richard could hear the careful neutrality in her tone. "I'll need to examine you properly," she said, "and we should make arrangements for the delivery. Will you want me here at the house?" Catherine's reply came quick and firm. "I will, and I'll need your discretion, Miriam." The midwife promised it without hesitation. Only when the 2 women had left did Richard slip out from behind the bookcase, his hands trembling. He knew the truth. His father had been bedridden the entire month of January, fevered and fading, incapable of what Catherine claimed. The timing was impossible. The child growing in her belly had been conceived months after Jonathan's death. Catherine was planning to pass it off as her late husband's heir, a fraud that would wreck the family's reputation if discovered. Creditors would descend the Danforths, would cast her out, and Thornhill itself could be seized. Beyond the risk, though, Richard felt something colder revulsion at Catherine's deceit. At 16, his choices were limited. He could confront her, but the law gave her absolute authority. He could go to Talbot, the lawyer, but without proof, his accusations would be dismissed. He could write to his grandfather in Augusta, but Catherine monitored every letter that left the estate. Instead, Richard began to watch. He noticed Catherine often summoned Isaac to the house at night when the overseer was away. Her manner toward him was different, not soft, but measured as if she regarded him as something more than a tool. She spoke to him in full sentences, even tempered nothing like the clipped commands she gave others. By July, Richard was convinced Isaac was the father. The thought horrified him, not only because of the transgression itself, but because of what it revealed about Catherine. She wasn't careless or desperate. She was deliberate, ruthless, and willing to cross every boundary to see her design through. In August, when Catherine traveled to Waynesboro, Richard prowled through her study in search of anything that might give him leverage. In the back of her writing desk, he found a locked drawer, and within it, a leather-bound book. The lock was simple, no match for a determined boy with shaking hands. The pages inside were written in cipher. To anyone else, they might have seemed unreadable, but Richard had always loved puzzles, and as he stared at the strange codes and symbols, he realized with dawning dread that he had uncovered the hidden logic of his stepmother's monstrous plan. For 3 long days, Richard bent over the strange cipher, piecing it together, bit by bit, while Catherine was away. When the key finally clicked into place, the truth spilled out across the pages, and it left him shaken to his core. Catherine wasn't simply conducting a secret affair, she had devised an entire breeding program. The journal read like a farmer's handbook for livestock, but the subjects were human beings. She detailed her intention to bear multiple children with carefully chosen enslaved men to raise those children under her authority, and then to pair them with each other and others to build a self-replicating population, bound to Thornhill by blood as much as by law. Page after page carried charts and calculations, estimates of how many births she expected over 5-year spans, assessments of which men showed strength, cleverness, or steadiness of character. She speculated coldly on which qualities might be passed down, as if she were cataloging horseflesh. Richard, trembling with horror, copied several passages into plain English. For the first time, he held evidence proof of Catherine's intentions. But that evening, when they sat down to supper, Catherine's gaze cut into him like a blade. "Richard," she said evenly, "have you been in my study? Some of my papers seem disturbed." He lied, throat tight. "No, ma'am." Her knife sliced through meat with steady rhythm as she continued. "I keep certain documents locked away for good reason. If anyone were to violate that trust, I would have to take action. Do you understand?" He managed to nod. Her smile never warmed her eyes. "Good. Because family loyalty is everything. Without it, we're nothing but animals tearing each other apart. I know you loved your father. I'd hate for his memory to be stained by scandal, especially one born inside this household." The threat was unmistakable. Catherine was warning him that any attempt to expose her would be turned against him. Who would the world believe, a prominent widow from an old Augusta family, or a brooding 16-year-old stepson known to resent her? That night, Richard crept back to his room, fed the translated pages to the fire, and stared at the flames until the ink curled into ash. But he didn't stop watching. It was then that his health began to falter. At first, it was simple weariness. Then came the splitting headaches, the waning appetite, the dull ache in his muscles. By early autumn, he could hardly make it through an afternoon without collapsing into bed. Catherine fussed over him like a dutiful stepmother, bringing him bowls of broth she had prepared herself, insisting he stay abed. She even called for Mrs. Grayson, the midwife, who diagnosed nervous exhaustion, perhaps even the beginnings of consumption. To Richard, half delirious and weak, it seemed almost like concern. But beneath her careful care, he could not shake the gnawing suspicion that Catherine herself was the cause of his decline. Mrs. Grayson's verdict was simple rest, fresh air when he could manage it, and a tonic Catherine had procured from a pharmacist in Augusta. Catherine sat beside Richard's bed, smoothing his blankets, her voice calm, almost motherly. "Tuberculosis often strikes young men of sensitive nature," she said. "Your father had a cousin who died at just your age. We must be vigilant." But Richard, pale and trembling, knew better. He had studied enough medical texts in the library to recognize the truth. His exhaustion, stomach pains, and wasting body bore not the mark of consumption, but of arsenic. Catherine was poisoning him, disguising slow murder as an illness no one would question. By November, he was too weak to stand for long, let alone seek help. The servants obeyed Catherine without hesitation, and the overseer seldom entered the main house. Richard was a prisoner in his own bedroom. In desperation, he attempted one last act of defiance. Over 3 agonizing days, he wrote to his grandfather Danforth in Augusta, confessing everything: Catherine's breeding program, the ciphered journal, the poisoning. When the letter was finished, he entrusted it to Pearl, a timid young servant girl, begging her to smuggle it to the post office in Waynesboro. Pearl, terrified of Catherine, carried it straight to the mistress instead. Catherine read the letter in silence, then fed it to the fire in Richard's presence. "You're very ill, darling," she murmured, voice low and soothing, almost tender. "The fever has unbalanced your mind. You imagine things that aren't real. It is a mercy truly that you won't suffer much longer." On December 3rd, 1847, just weeks before his 17th birthday, Richard Thornhill was dead. The official cause, written by Dr. Samuel Pritchard of Waynesboro, was consumption. He noted with pity how quickly the young man had wasted away. Catherine wept appropriately at the funeral, wore mourning black for a year, and carried herself as a grieving widow should. 4 days after Richard was laid in the ground, she delivered a healthy boy. She named him Jonathan after her late husband and explained away the awkward timing by claiming the child was born prematurely. In Burke County, no one asked too many questions. Those who suspected quietly did their arithmetic, then kept the matter to themselves. Between 1848 and 1856, Thornhill Estate rose from near collapse to renewed prosperity. Cotton yields improved, debts were managed, and the enslaved population increased. Neighbors whispered about Catherine's uncanny ability to wring order out of decline. They called her efficient, shrewd, perhaps overly private, but undeniably effective. What they never saw was the true cost. Catherine bore 4 more children in those years: 3 daughters, Elenina, Abigail, and Margaret, and another son, Samuel. Each birth was overseen by Miriam Grayson, now entangled so deeply in Catherine's designs that silence was no longer a choice, but a condition of her survival. Catherine rewarded her handsomely with fees that dwarfed her normal pay and a rent-free cottage on Thornhill land. But Grayson's duties went far beyond midwifery. When enslaved women conceived children outside Catherine's carefully mapped pairings, Grayson intervened. She carried with her abortifacients, bitter brews of roots and herbs that induced miscarriage, and administered them in a small room tucked behind the overseer's cottage. These secret procedures left scars, physical and emotional, but the women rarely spoke of them. In the suffocating world of Thornhill, silence was survival. The pain Catherine inflicted on Thornhill's enslaved population went far beyond the physical. Women carried a grief that could not be spoken, trapped in a world where even their own bodies did not belong to them. Yet whispers spread in the quarters. Stories of pregnancies that ended suddenly, of women who bled for days after a visit to Mrs. Grayson, and of children lost before they ever had a chance to live. Everyone knew these were not accidents, though they rarely dared to say it aloud. One woman Ruth tried to resist. In the spring of 1851, when she was 5 months along, Catherine discovered the child she carried was not fathered by the man she had chosen for her, but by a young field hand named Samuel, a man Ruth loved. Catherine demanded an immediate termination. Ruth fled into the pine forests, running nearly 4 miles before the overseer's dogs dragged her back. She was pinned down as Mrs. Grayson forced the bitter compounds into her body. Ruth lived through the ordeal, but her spirit did not. She became quiet, mechanical, hollow, and 2 years later, during a fever outbreak, she was gone at just 24. By 1856, Catherine's experiment was bearing fruit in the most sinister way. She had 7 of her own children, all carefully folded into the household as if they were wards rather than slaves. On paper, they were registered in county records as enslaved, giving Catherine legal ownership. But within the house, they were dressed decently, fed better than the rest, and secretly taught to read and write by Catherine herself. To outsiders, she called them orphans she had taken in out of Christian duty. To the children, she presented herself as protector and benefactor. Jonathan, her eldest, was 8 that year. He mirrored Catherine in every feature, the piercing green eyes, the auburn hair, and had no memory of Isaac, his true father sold off to Alabama years earlier, when his usefulness was at an end. Catherine's ambitions stretched far beyond raising children. She was grooming a bloodline, charting their growth in her coded journals, noting strength, intelligence, obedience, and planning pairings decades before they would come of age. Between 1854 and 1856, she bore 3 more children, William Henry and Caroline, each fathered by different enslaved men chosen with ruthless calculation. Teeth, eyesight, stamina. These were Catherine's criteria, the raw material of her human stock. The men themselves had no say. When summoned to the main house, they obeyed because refusal meant pain or exile. One of them, Thomas, tried to resist in 1855. He was 26, married to Hannah, who was pregnant with their first child. He begged not to be used. The overseer, Virgil Kane, made an example of him, stripping him bare and delivering 39 lashes before the entire enslaved population. His back was ruined forever, and then Catherine had him brought to her anyway. Broken Thomas submitted. He never told Hannah what happened in the main house. She never asked. Some silences were too heavy to touch. By 1856, Thornhill Estate looked like any other mid-sized plantation from the outside. But beneath that surface, it was organized according to Catherine's chilling design. There were the field hands, about 20 adults with their children bent to the endless cycle of cotton and corn under the overseer's whip. There were the house servants, 3 women and 1 elderly man, who kept the main house running with cooking, cleaning, and daily chores. And then there were Catherine's special children, 10 in all, from 8 years old, down to infants set apart from the rest of the enslaved population. Their place in the hierarchy was strange and precarious. The other enslaved people envied the privileges, better food, decent clothes, and lessons in reading and writing, but pitied them too. Everyone in the quarters understood, even without modern language for it, that these children were being raised for something unnatural. They saw Catherine's obsessive record-keeping, the way she measured the children's height and weight, noted their dispositions in her coded journal, and spoke of them not as sons and daughters, but as seedlings and harvests. No one doubted her ultimate intent. These children were to become the foundation of a self-reproducing labor force, one that could never be sold away, never flee, because they were Catherine's flesh and Thornhill's property. It was an atrocity dressed up as efficiency. And yet, in the world of 1850s Georgia, it didn't seem so alien. Absolute power belonged to the landowners, and the law already recognized enslaved people as property. Catherine's system was colder, more deliberate, but not outside the logic of slavery itself. That was the darkest truth. She had simply pushed the existing order to its extreme conclusion. The only person who might have stopped her was Ambrose Talbot, the Westboro lawyer who handled Thornhill's accounts and filings. But Talbot was pragmatic, not moral. As the estate's debts shrank and cotton yields rose, he had no incentive to pry into Catherine's methods. A profitable client was worth more than uncomfortable questions. Thornhill's remoteness kept suspicion away as well. 7 miles from town, down a rough road that washed out in winter with the nearest neighbor 3 miles distant, the estate was as isolated as Catherine wanted it. She discouraged visitors, rarely left the property, except for church or the occasional social obligation, and presented herself at those times as the very model of a virtuous widow, dignified and industrious. To her peers, she seemed a woman who had saved a faltering plantation through discipline and good management. And if anyone had guessed the truth, would they have cared? In a society built on bondage, what Catherine was doing may have been monstrous, but it wasn't unthinkable. Slavery had long treated people as breeding stock. She had only stripped away the pretense and systematized it. But such systems carry within them the seeds of their undoing. By the late 1850s, storms were gathering. In Burke County, as across the South, talk of secession resistance to federal authority and the uneasy balance between profit and morality grew sharper. Few could imagine how quickly change would come, or how violently it would shatter Catherine's carefully constructed world. The storm over slavery's expansion into new territories raged across the nation, filling newspapers and courthouse steps with talk of Kansas violence and the looming crisis. Yet at Thornhill, Catherine kept her gaze fixed inward. National politics meant little to her compared to the quiet unfolding of her private empire. By 1859, her eldest children were on the cusp of adolescence: Jonathan at 11, Elena at 10, Abigail at 9. Too young still for the next phase of her plan, but not too young for Catherine to begin arranging their futures. She was already mapping which enslaved children would serve as their partners when the time came. It was in these years that she created what she called the Heritage Room in the east wing of the mansion. To outsiders, it was nothing more than storage for family records. In truth, it was her shrine. The windowless chamber glowed with lamplight and reeked of oil. Along its walls stood shelves filled with her coded journals, 3 thick volumes by 1859, each page detailing births, pairings, and observations of her children as if they were livestock. Beside them, small vials held locks of hair, carefully labeled with names and dates, organized by lineage like specimens in a naturalist's collection. On the great table at the room's center, Catherine spread elaborate genealogical charts. They were not family trees, but breeding diagrams where human names connected with inked lines and notes: strong constitution, good teeth, compliant temperament. She penciled in imagined pairings: Abigail with Jacob, the son of Thomas; Elena with Marcus, the son Isaac would father in 1862; Margaret with Samuel's nephew Peter. Each line extended into the future, her mind filling with visions of 100 descendants bound to Thornhill flesh of her flesh, and yet enslaved, a workforce that could never be bought, sold, or freed. To bring this vision to life, Catherine tightened her grip on every aspect of plantation life. She divided the young into categories: her own children sheltered near the main house and raised as favored wards, and the rest, the enslaved children of the quarters, destined for labor, but just as crucial for the mixing she required. Families were manipulated with care. Small privileges for those who obeyed her: pairings whispered threats of separation or sale for those who resisted. The cruelty of this system became clear in 1860 when Catherine set her sights on Sarah, the 14-year-old daughter of a woman named Violet. Catherine decreed that Sarah would be paired with Elijah, a seasoned field hand in his 30s. Sarah was still a child, trembling with fear at the idea of being bound to a man old enough to be her father. Violet begged Catherine to delay, to give her daughter more time. Catherine's response was icy, her voice stripped of even the pretense of compassion. "Time is a luxury you and your daughter do not own. She will do as I say, or she will be sent away." For Violet, like everyone else on Thornhill, there was no choice. Resistance meant ruin. Catherine's logic ruled the plantation like scripture, and every life within its reach was bent to her design. "You have 2 younger daughters," Violet to Catherine had said, her tone like steel wrapped in silk. "Shall I sell them instead? Or will Sarah do her duty to this estate and to you?" And so Sarah was forced into the union, Catherine demanded. That autumn she was paired with Elijah, and 9 months later, at just 15, she died delivering a child. The baby lived, but Sarah's body did not survive the strain. Violet was shattered beyond repair. She moved like a ghost through her remaining years, until in 1862, she walked into the Savannah River and did not come back. But to the outside world, nothing seemed amiss. Thornhill appeared orderly, even prosperous. Visitors saw fields in neat rows, a sturdy houseworkers who looked healthy enough. The rot was hidden in the quarters, where grief festered in the heritage room, where Catherine's journals mapped out her obsessions, in the silences no one dared break. Then came the seismic shift of 1860. Lincoln was elected. South Carolina seceded in December, Georgia, the following January. By April 1861, with the bombardment of Fort Sumter, war had begun. What many in Burke County imagined would be a short conflict stretched into years of blood and attrition. Sons marched off in gray, and too often returned in boxes or never returned at all. The war unsettled Catherine's carefully built world. Virgil Kane, her brutal overseer, enlisted in 1861 and died at Shiloh the next spring. In his place, she hired Silas Kendrick, an older man too frail for service. Kendrick lacked Kane's cruelty, but also his ability to terrify. Discipline weakened, and whispers grew louder. Across the South, enslaved people carried scraps of news, along secret lines of communication, rumors of Lincoln's proclamation of Union victories of freedom drawing closer. Catherine responded with her own form of wartime discipline. She forbade anyone to leave the plantation, even to visit family. She slightly increased rations to curb hunger and reduce the urge to run. And most chillingly, she hastened her breeding program. Children were pushed into roles earlier than she had planned. In December 1862, Jonathan, her eldest, turned 15. Catherine decided he was ready. She chose Rachel, a 16-year-old daughter of a field hand, and in February 1863, she staged a wedding inside the main house. She officiated herself, crafting a grotesque parody of ceremony to cloak the pairing in respectability. Jonathan, sheltered from the truth, accepted without question. To him, Catherine was his benefactor, the woman who raised him. He did not know she was his mother. He did not understand that his life, his choices had been stripped from him before he was even born. Rachel knew. She had no voice, no power, but her silence was its own kind of scream. And in the quarters, the others saw. They saw Jonathan, Catherine's favored son, bound in a twisted union. They saw Rachel broken into compliance. And they began to understand in their bones that Thornhill's horror was reaching its breaking point. We're slaves. Our own mother enslaved us. She's protecting us. She's keeping us together. If we were sold, we'd be separated, sent to different places, This way, we stay together. We stay at Thornhill. Elena realized with horror that Jonathan had been too successfully indoctrinated. He couldn't see the cage Catherine had built around all of them. But Abigail, 13 years old and sharp as glass, understood immediately when Elena told her. And Margaret at 12 understood too. The younger children were still too young to fully grasp it. But the older ones, they knew now. They knew what they were and what Catherine intended for them. The knowledge changed the atmosphere in the main house. Catherine felt it. That shift in the air, the way her children looked at her now. There was fear, yes, but also something else. Calculation waiting. They were biding their time, and Catherine knew it. She considered her options. She could sell the older children, eliminate the problem, but that would waste years of investment and planning. She could punish them severely enough to break their spirits. But physical brutality might damage them in ways that would interfere with the breeding program. She needed them healthy, capable of bearing children. So Catherine chose a different approach. She would demonstrate the consequences of disobedience through someone else. In August 1863, a young woman named Grace tried to run away from Thornhill Estate. She was 17, pregnant, and desperate. She had been paired with one of the field hands against her will, and she couldn't bear the thought of bringing a child into this system. She ran at night, heading east toward the Savannah River, hoping to somehow cross into South Carolina and from there make her way to Union lines. She was caught within 12 hours. The dogs tracked her to a creek 3 mi from the plantation. She was brought back locked in one of the outbuildings. And the next morning, Catherine assembled everyone, all the enslaved people, including her special children, from the main house in the yard between the quarters and the mansion. Grace was brought out, her hands tied. Catherine stood on the porch of the main house, her face expressionless. This woman attempted to abandon her responsibilities to this estate and to all of you. She attempted to destroy the family we have built here. The penalty for such betrayal must be severe. What followed was brutal. Grace was whipped publicly. 20 lashes administered by the elderly overseer Kendrick, who carried out the punishment with grim reluctance. Catherine made all the children watch, including her own biological offspring. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who try to leave. But Catherine had miscalculated again. The public punishment didn't terrify the enslaved population into submission. Instead, it clarified something for them. Catherine was willing to use extreme violence to maintain her control, which meant she was afraid. And if she was afraid, that meant they had more power than they'd realized. Whispers began circulating through the quarters in the weeks that followed. Whispers about waiting for the right moment. Whispers about what would happen when the war ended, because surely it would end, and surely the Yankees would come south, and surely things would change. All they had to do was survive until then. Elena heard these whispers. She began spending time near the quarters when Catherine wasn't watching developing relationships with the other enslaved people she had been kept separate from her entire life. She learned things Catherine had never told her about her father Thomas, about the other men Catherine had used, about the women who had died or been broken by Catherine's program. One evening in October, Elena met with a group of the older enslaved women in the woods beyond the quarters. They sat in a circle in the darkness, speaking in low voices. A woman named Hope in her 40s looked at Elena with something between pity and respect. "Your mama. She thinks she made something special here," Hope said quietly. "Thinks she made family, but all she did was make people who hate her in ways she can't even understand." "What happens when the war ends?" Eleanor asked. "Depends on who wins," Hope replied. "Yankees win, we're free. Confederates win. Things stay the same or get worse. But either way, your mama can't keep doing what she'd been doing. Too many people know. Too many people angry. Something got to break. Jonathan clung to Catherine's narrative. She's protecting us, he told Elena. She's keeping us together. If we were sold, we'd be scattered. This way we stay at Thornhill. To him, the gilded cage looked like safety. To Eleanor, it was still a cage. Abigail, only 13, but sharper than a blade, saw the truth instantly when her sister showed her the decoded entries. Margaret, at 12, understood too. The younger children were too small to grasp it, but the oldest among them now carried the unbearable knowledge of who they were and what Catherine intended them to become. That awareness changed everything. Catherine sensed it. The shift in glances, the heavy silence in rooms where there had once been obedient stillness. Her children still feared her, but now there was calculation in their eyes, waiting. Catherine weighed her options. She could sell them off, but that would destroy years of careful planning. She could break them physically, but that risked ruining the bodies she needed for her next generation. Instead, she chose demonstration violence against another to remind her children of the price of defiance. The opportunity came in August 1863, when Grace, a 17-year-old girl, paired against her will, tried to escape. Pregnant and desperate, she fled east under cover of darkness, aiming for the Savannah River and the distant hope of Union lines. Dogs caught her less than half a day later, huddled in a creek bed 3 miles away. She was dragged back, locked in an outbuilding overnight. The next morning, Catherine gathered everyone. The field hands, the house servants, even her special children into the yard. Grace was brought out, her wrists bound. From the porch, Catherine's voice carried across the crowd. This woman tried to abandon her family, abandon her duty. Such betrayal cannot be tolerated. With grim reluctance, old Silas Kendrick delivered 20 lashes across Grace's back. The whip cracked, the crowd flinched, and Catherine made certain her children watched every strike. She meant it as a warning, but the lesson backfired. Instead of cementing control, the spectacle exposed Catherine's fear. Violence that naked meant desperation. And if she was desperate, she was vulnerable. Whispers began to ripple through the quarters. Wait for the Yankees. Wait for the war to turn. Hold on, and then strike. Elena listened. She began slipping away when Catherine wasn't watching, spending time with the people she had been raised to see only from a distance. She listened to their stories about her father Thomas, about the men used and discarded, about the women who had died from Catherine's schemes. Slowly, she began to understand not only what had been done to her, but what it had cost others. One night in October, she sat in a ring of women in the woods, fireless, speaking low under the trees. Hope, a weathered woman in her 40s, studied her with something between pity and respect. "Your mama thinks she built a family," Hope said. "Thinks she made something nobody else ever thought of. But all she made is people who hate her in ways she can't imagine." Eleanor's voice broke the hush. "What happens when the war ends?" Hope's reply was steady. "Depends who wins. Yankees win, we're free. Confederates win, maybe worse than now. But no matter what, your mama can't keep on. Too many know. Too many angry. Something gonna break." The air in the heritage room was thick with the smell of oil lamps and dust. 11 children stood among the shelves, staring at their mother as her words echoed against the brick walls. Catherine's voice was steady, but fever-bright, the voice of someone who had already crossed a line inside her own mind. "This is our legacy," she said, gesturing at the journals, the vials, the family trees. "This is what we've built together. No one will take it from us." She set the wooden box on the table and opened it. Inside, nestled in straw, were several glass bottles of clear liquid. She held one up to the lamplight. "This is laudanum," she said softly. "In small amounts, it eases suffering. In larger amounts, it provides eternal peace. Tonight, we secure our future. Tonight, we stay together." Abigail's gasp broke the silence. "You're going to kill us," she whispered. Catherine's eyes flicked to her calm, unblinking. "No," she said. "I'm going to save you. If the Yankees come, they will scatter you like leaves in a storm. They will make you strangers. You'll be cast into a world that despises you, half white, half black, belonging nowhere. But if we do this, if we take this together, we remain a family forever. We will be safe. No one will hurt you." Elena felt her stomach drop. In that moment, she understood what Catherine truly was. Not just ruthless, not just deluded, but prepared to annihilate everything she had made rather than lose control. "No," she said hoarsely. "You're not saving us. You're killing us." Catherine's gaze sharpened, her tone almost soothing. "You don't understand now. But you will." She began pouring measured doses into a row of porcelain cups, her movements practiced deliberate. "Drink this. It will be quick. You'll fall asleep and never wake." Jonathan, standing nearest to Catherine, looked confused, but not horrified, his indoctrination still intact. He reached for a cup without thinking. Elena lunged, grabbing his arm. "Don't," she hissed. "She's lying." Abigail moved to Elena's side, her face white with terror. Margaret began to cry. The younger children stared, too small to comprehend. Catherine's hand tightened on the bottle. "Enough," she snapped. "This is happening. Drink." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Elena stepped between Catherine and the cups. "You can kill me," she said, voice shaking. "But you're not killing them." Catherine's face contorted rage, fear, desperation, all at once. "Do you think you can stop me?" she hissed. "I made you. You are mine." And at that moment outside the house, a shout rang out, a man's voice urgent and the sound of boots. Then more voices, horses, and the metallic crack of rifles being readied. The children turned toward the sound. Catherine froze, the bottle still in her hand. Union soldiers had arrived at Thornhill Estate. Catherine's voice rang with frantic conviction, twisting poison into salvation. "You think I want to kill you? I want to protect you. If the Yankees come, where will you go? You'll belong nowhere, too white for one world, too black for another. Here you stay together. Here you stay with me." But Eleanor's answer was firm, cold as iron. "Anything is better than this." For the first time, Catherine's mask cracked. She turned to the bottles, but Jonathan stepped between her and the laudanum. He was nearly grown, nearly her equal in height, and there was something new in his eyes' resolve. "No." Catherine's voice hardened. "Jonathan, don't be foolish. You understand the plan. You've always understood." His voice shook but held steady. "I understood what you told me. But Eleanor showed me the journals. I know who my father was. I know who you are." Catherine's hand struck him hard across the face. "How dare you? After everything I've sacrificed?" Eleanor stepped forward, her voice sharp. "You sacrificed nothing. You used people. You destroyed them. You destroyed us." For a heartbeat, Catherine stood frozen, staring at the children she had raised to obey. Now they were united against her, even the younger ones too young to grasp the full horror since betrayal, and drew close to their siblings. Catherine realized she had lost them. Something in her broke. If she could not hold her children, then she would hold the proof. She lunged for her journals, the vials, the charts, the record of everything she had built. "These will survive," she cried, clutching the evidence to her chest. "They'll prove I was right." She shoved past them and bolted from the heritage room. Jonathan and Eleanor gave chase, but Catherine ran like a woman possessed through the front hall out into the night across the yard toward the quarters. Shouts erupted. Cabin doors flew open. Men and women spilled out into the dark, startled, then seething as they saw her, this woman who had ruled their lives with cruelty, clutching the trophies of their torment. What happened next was never told the same way twice. Some said Hope was the first to move. Others claimed it was one of the men, or several at once. Later accounts conflicted, shaped by memory and trauma. But one truth was shared that night in the yard, between mansion and quarters. Catherine Thornhill met the fury she had sown. When Jonathan and Eleanor arrived, the scene was chaos. Voices shouting, people scattering firelight, licking at the edges of the dark. Catherine's papers smoldered, her journals torn and scattered in the mud. The glass vials shattered into glittering shards. But Catherine herself was gone. Jonathan's voice broke. "Where is she?" Hope looked at him with calm finality. "Gone. That's all you need to know. She ain't coming back." "What did you do to her?" Jonathan demanded. "What she had coming," Hope said. "Now you got a choice. You can raise hell about your mama, or you can understand that justice was done here tonight and let it rest." Eleanor caught her brother's eye. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but she gave a slow, deliberate nod. Let it rest. And so it did. The next morning, Catherine was reported missing. Old Kendrick scoured the grounds, then called the sheriff from Waynesboro. The conclusion was simple. With Union forces pressing deeper into Georgia, the widow Thornhill had likely fled in fear. It was plausible. It was convenient. And it was wrong. Everyone at Thornhill knew the truth, though no one spoke it aloud. Catherine had been killed that night, her body hidden somewhere among the plantation's 700 acres. Her children, her so-called legacy, had chosen silence, because they understood that silence, too, could be justice. The war ended the following spring. Sherman's army tore through Georgia in late 1864, 30 miles north of Burke County, leaving Thornhill untouched. By April 1865, the Confederacy was dead, and Catherine Thornhill's grand design had died long before it buried in the red clay of Burke County, erased not by armies or proclamations, but by the people she had tried to own. Freedom did not arrive at Thornhill Estate in a single sweeping moment, but in a slow unraveling, the inevitable collapse of a system too rotten to stand. Across Georgia, emancipation came through the advance of Union troops, the ratification of the 13th Amendment, and the sheer impossibility of sustaining bondage once the Confederacy fell. At Thornhill, however, the process was tangled. Jonathan, Catherine's eldest son, had some claim to the estate, but his position was paradoxical, legally enslaved by Georgia law, yet her acknowledged heir in practice. Lawyer Talbot of Waynesboro wrestled with the contradiction, filing and withdrawing petitions. But in the end, he abandoned the matter. The property slipped into limbo, a place without a master. Most of Thornhill's formerly enslaved residents departed within weeks. They scattered in every direction, some toward family long sold away, some toward new cities swelling with freed people, some simply toward distance away from the soil that had soaked up too much suffering. A few remained. Hope stayed long enough to help organize those with nowhere else to go. Thomas stayed to Eleanor's father, who for the first time in 16 years could speak to his daughter as a father. They shared a single raw conversation about Catherine, and then agreed never to speak of her again. Eleanor herself lingered until 1867, struggling to learn what freedom meant after a childhood designed to deny it. She carried scars no one could see, and they never healed. She moved to Savannah, found work as a seamstress, and married a carpenter named William Foster. She never bore children. She never spoke of Thornhill. When she died in 1903, Her obituary listed her as a respected member of her church community. No mention of Burke County, no mention of Catherine. Jonathan tried longer to salvage the estate. With a handful of freedmen, he attempted to coax crops from the depleted soil. But the cotton market was collapsing, the land was spent, and Thornhill's reputation was whispered like a curse among Burke County's black community. By 1869, he gave up leaving the estate behind. He drifted west, settling in Texas under another name. He died in 1891 with a single notebook among his belongings. In its pages over and over, in cramped handwriting, he had written the same words. I did not choose this. I did not choose this. The estate itself rotted quickly. In 1871, part of the main house burned in what many believed was arson. By the late 1870s, the remaining structures sagged in ruin. The county seized the land for unpaid taxes in 1878 and sold it to a timber company, which stripped the old-growth trees and parceled out the acreage. But in 1871, before the sale, something surfaced that briefly pulled Thornhill's shadowed history into public light. A well driller on a neighboring property broke through into an old cistern buried deep underground. Inside lay a skeleton female, early middle age, the bones largely intact from decades in cool, dry darkness. Scraps of fabric clung to the remains, the ghost of a dress from the 1860s. Near the skull, dented and split, lay a corroded locket. Inside were two portraits, a man and a young boy. The Waynesboro coroner examined the remains, recording the cause of death as blunt force trauma. The woman was buried in an unmarked grave in the county cemetery, identified in records only as unknown female discovered former Thornhill property, 1871. Officially nameless. But in Burke County's black churches and kitchens, there was no mystery. The story had lived in whispers for years, coded so carefully that no outsider could ever be certain yet clear to those who had been there. The devil mistress had been struck down. Her body dropped into a cistern. Justice of a kind had been done. Over time, fragments of confirmation surfaced like bones rising in the soil. In 1889, a dying man in Alabama confessed to a minister that he had helped kill his mistress in Georgia during the war. He gave no names, no dates, but the words were written in the church record. In 1902, Hope's granddaughter penned a short memoir in Savannah that mentioned the night the devil mistress disappeared and nobody mourned her. The most conclusive evidence came 2 decades later. In 1923, a historian digging through the Burke County courthouse basement stumbled upon a forgotten cache of letters. Letters that once read would peel back the thin veil of silence that had hung over Thornhill for nearly 60 years. Among the documents rediscovered in 1923 was a letter written in 1865 by Union Captain Samuel Reynolds, who had led one of the first federal units into Burke County after the war. In that letter, he wrote, "We discovered disturbing evidence at a property called Thornhill Estate, indications of systematic breeding experiments conducted by the late owner upon enslaved persons, including her own biological offspring. The details are too grotesque to relate in full. But multiple witnesses confirmed that the woman, one Catherine Thornhill, had implemented a program to create a self-perpetuating enslaved population through forced reproduction across generations. The witnesses also informed us that Mrs. Thornhill disappeared in March 1864, and though they would not explicitly state what occurred, their meaning was clear enough. I have elected not to pursue the matter further, as it seems to me that whatever justice was enacted upon this woman was well-deserved." Reynolds ordered his men to stay silent. The letter was filed away and forgotten for nearly 90 years until a graduate student stumbled upon it in 1954 while researching Reconstruction. She tried to confirm the story, interviewing the oldest residents of Burke County. Most claimed ignorance, One woman, 93 years old, and the great-granddaughter of an enslaved person from Thornhill, said only, "Some things happened that needed to happen. Some people did things that needed doing." That's all that needs to be said. But one mystery has never been solved. The 23 children Union soldiers found locked in Thornhill's basement when they broke open the iron doors. They were freed, placed with freedmen's families, and then disappeared into history. Some of them surely lived to adulthood. Some must have had children of their own. Which means that today, scattered across Georgia and beyond, there are likely people who carry Catherine Thornhill's bloodline without knowing it. People with pale green eyes or auburn hair, descendants of a program designed not in love, but in cruelty. Her children, her journals, her breeding charts, all were meant to preserve her legacy. Instead, they buried her. Catherine Thornhill's body lies somewhere in Burke County in an unmarked grave dug by the very people she tried to control. Her name is absent from local histories, her house left to ruin her empire devoured by forest and time. And yet her story persists in whispers, in genealogies and oral histories told carefully in black communities across Burke County. Not because people want to remember her, but because they need to remember the resistance, the survival, the truth that power built on human suffering can be destroyed from within. Catherine convinced herself she was building something revolutionary. What she built was a nightmare, one erased by the very people she sought to erase. And that perhaps is its truest legacy. So what do you think? Was everything revealed that night in 1864, or are there still secrets buried under the red soil of Burke County? The truth is, we may never know. Survivors carried some knowledge with them to the grave, and maybe that's their right. But we can honor them by remembering that their survival mattered, their resistance mattered, and that they endured long enough to see freedom come. If this story shook you, if it made you think about the hidden histories buried in your own community, let me know in the comments. Share this video with someone who appreciates the kind of history that unsettles and challenges. Subscribe for more stories that shine a light on America's darkest corners. And remember, the past is never as far behind us as we like to believe.